Hey there, DynamicsCon. I'm super excited to be doing my first presentation at DynamicsCon, and probably my first presentation since high school also. My name is Troy Dahnert, and I work with Stone Ridge Software, and I'm a senior developer, and let's begin. So I wanted to start off talking a little bit about how it is that I came to be doing a presentation today. I'd been at a new position for about 2 months, and my boss approached me and said that we really needed to have volunteers for the upcoming DynamicsCon presentations, and would I be interested in doing it. He asked me about getting a presentation on the virtual entities and on Azure Data Factory that I've been working on recently. My response back to him was that I'd be interested in doing it, but I really wanted to do a presentation on what it means to be a lazy developer instead. It's a topic that I've got a big interest in and that I've helped mentor junior developers on for a while. So let's talk a little bit about, what is a lazy developer, because it's usually seen as with negative connotations. A lazy developer takes a look through the processes and the code that they have and tries to identify redundancy, things that they're doing over and over again. They're adding little value to their process. So when they find those, they go through and eliminate them and then end up with a better result. So let's talk about what my qualifications are to talk about this. I'm going to guarantee that none of the ideas that you're going to see today are original. When I was preparing for this presentation, I basically went through the bookmarks that I've collected over the years and that I've shared with other developers and put together topics on each of those bookmarks. A little bit about the target audience that we have today. So 90% of this presentation is really aimed at developers. We're going to look at code today. We're going to talk about coding processes and talk about coding tools. There is some content in here for all the other people. I think that there's something to be learned about the process that we use to identify redundancy and eliminate it. And we've also got a few tools in here that are going to be non-developer tools also. So where is it that we encounter redundancy? I know that on a daily basis I encounter redundancy throughout my code in a lot of basic things like null handling, checking to see whether values exist before I do future things with them. We have a lot of redundancy that happens in our error handling, or we just have no error handling at all. So let's take a look at a simple example of how redundancy gets out of hand on us. So here we have some of the most basic code that you can have in D365. We start off by initializing a variable. After that variable has been initialized, we check to see whether it exists inside our entity collection or not. And we're going to give it a name for what it is that we're looking for. Then we want to populate that variable that we created earlier with the value and do a string conversion on it. It doesn't get much simpler than this code. Anyone who is not a junior developer would take something like this and try and make it more readable by using some of the C# features and consolidate that down to a single line of code. So here we've got the exact same thing, but as one line. The problem becomes once we have additional variables that we're trying to deal with also, suddenly this gets completely out of control, difficult to view. What we've done now is we've consolidated those multiple things into a single extension method, and suddenly the code becomes much more readable. Suddenly the code is no longer duplicating our string names that we have. We're going to go into this technique and several others today, all of them focused around how it is that we get rid of the redundant code that we write over and over again. So it might seem trivial that we've eliminated maybe 20 characters for each of those, but each of those characters add up. We want to be spending less time writing and editing long boilerplate code that goes over and over again and start working on the hard problems. Developers don't want to be doing that kind of coding. So the other advantage of getting rid of that boilerplate code is the job satisfaction that comes out of it. I don't know about you, but when I take a look at a piece of code like this, it frankly makes me want to gouge my eyes out. This is the kind of stuff that I hate doing over and over again. It's just simply not fun. So now we're starting to get into some of the most important advantages of being a lazy developer. We've got fewer bugs available if we write our code in a more succinct way. Let's take a look at the previous code that we had. I've introduced into here a typo, and I want to see how fast the audience can find it. I'm guessing it would take almost till the end of this presentation. So here we have a single missing U on this line. So the problem with this is twofold. One is because we've got so much busy code on the screen, it's extremely difficult to find these types of bugs. The second issue is that because we've used this string name 2 times, the first time we got it right. If our code was done running after we declared this string the first time, we'd never get to the second spot. When we're having lots and lots of lines of code to do one thing, we're just introducing more opportunities for bugs to pop up. So our code maintainability is also difficult. When we have a single place that our code is written and we reference it from multiple other places in our code, then when Microsoft comes out with breaking changes or deprecations or new functionality, we've got one place that we can change it, and we don't have to be hunting and pecking through our existing code or doing searches. And the final thing that I feel is even probably the most important is the readability of the code. Someone told me once that developers spend 70% of their time reading code and only 30% writing it. I'm too lazy to go and look those kind of statistics up, but it sure makes sense to me. Reading code is the larger part of a developer's work, and writing is something that we do in our spare time. Let's talk a little bit about the goals that we have today. My goal for my audience is that you're able to identify at least one process that you're currently doing that's redundant. I then want to provide some resources for future study on eliminating that redundancy. Throughout my presentation, I'm going to be denoting these opportunities as hat tips. I'm pulling in my links that I have out to articles and then crediting the authors of those articles. Today is not intended to be a training session on how to do these techniques, and it's really not intended to show anything new and exciting in functionality that we have in the system. What we're looking at is processes that we do on a daily basis every day and how to do them better. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is sharing code across assemblies. And I'm going to suggest that we take a look into shared projects for doing this. Shared projects is relatively rare in most C# development because we simply make a reference between assemblies and we don't have to worry about whether those assemblies exist together. In the case of CRM development, though, we're not able to put multiple assemblies out. We can't load third-party assemblies into our code. So in the case of a plugin assembly that we have, that we want to have shared code with shared business logic and data access layer, a shared project is a feature in the Visual Studio development environment that allows us to automate the copying of all of that shared code behind the scenes into our plugin assembly. And when we have multiple plugin assemblies, a first and a second, it's going to copy it in both those. But you don't have to worry about copying that yourself or making modifications in all the places that you copied code out to. It also means that we can share our code across dissimilar spots, such as our plugin assembly and Azure functions. So usually it would be difficult to have a piece of code shared between those, but shared projects allow us to do so. So our first hat tip is going out to Divya Sekaran, and excuse me to anyone whose names I'm butchering today, but she wrote an excellent article called Shared Project, an Alternative to IL Merge in Dynamics CRM Plugin Development. IL Merge is a secondary method that you can use to share code and make references to code, copying it across, but it's not supported by Microsoft, whereas shared projects are, and it's more appropriate for situations where you have a third-party project, not something that you're going to be making ongoing updates to. The next method we're going to talk about is extension methods. Extension methods is very similar to something that you're probably already doing. I don't know many development teams that don't have an ongoing development helper library that they're constantly adding things to. They understand the benefit of reused code, but an extension method takes that to the next level and allows you to use shared code against assemblies that you've never written, like all the Microsoft libraries that we use. So let's take a look at this sample extension method. What makes this an extension method is the use of the this keyword that we have here. We have this, and then it's followed by what it is that we're extending, which in this case is an attribute collection. Attribute collection is not a class that I ever wrote. This is something that comes from the Microsoft library, and typically we wouldn't be able to add additional methods to it. But in this case, by using extension methods, every time that I start with an attribute collection, do the period, then the autocomplete is going to come up with the new contains key dirty method that I've created here, even though it's Microsoft code. In this case, as an example of something that you might find value in, we have a a method that's going to look through the target that's passed in here for a particular attribute name and then compare that against the pre-image. Typically, we're not able to tell just whether a attribute exists inside a target, whether that attribute is changed or not. So this allows us to verify not just that the attribute has been submitted in the target, that it was sent to the plugin, but whether the value is actually different than the original. Typically, this would be too much code that you wouldn't want to repeat this 30 times throughout your existing code to get this functionality. But when we add an extension method, it makes it very easy. And because we've added it as an extension method, our developers are all going to see it as they do the autocomplete. All right, another example of a good use of an extension method is my get attribute required. So in this case, we're introducing error handling, but we're making it more robust than a developer might do on their own, and we're making it more consistent. So as we take a look down here, we've passed in an entity and an attribute that we want to make sure exists inside the entity. Over here, we have returned an error message if it's not found that's giving both the entity name and the attribute name, so we're getting a meaningful error message back. A lot of times we don't get meaningful error messages back just because they're too difficult to be creating over and over, and so developers just skip over them. This makes it so easy that there's no excuse. Here's another example of an extension method. So here we're doing a get attribute value with fallback to image. A lot of times in plugin development, we choose to do post execution plugins because it's easy to use that image, the post image, that knows exactly what the values were after it's run. In this case, what we're doing is passing in both the target, the attribute that we're going for, and then the pre-image. This gives us the ability to check for the value that's in the target if it's there, and if it's not, then we're going to pull it back from the pre-image instead. Makes, again, something that could be very complicated, not very complicated, but just time consuming and a lot of code, very simple with a single method name. For extension methods, I'd strongly recommend an article by Nicholas Nowinski called CRM Dynamics Extensions to Improve I Organization Service. Next, let's talk a little bit about base classes. All developers who are working in .NET should know about basic inheritance and base classes. But a lot of people I find don't think to use them when it comes to CRM plugin development. If you implement a base class that is inherited by all of your plugin classes, it gives you an easy way that you're able to standardize the logging, standardize exception handling, and then things like image and target interactions. Here we've got a sample class, a sample bit of code that is pulled directly from Microsoft's Getting Started article. All of this code here, and we haven't done anything useful yet. We've got a section here that's commented out that this is where your business logic goes. All of this code can disappear if you're using base classes and inheriting them in your plugins, go behind the scenes and be easily maintainable, and make sure that the way that you're doing these is something that's standard for your organization. Here we can see that I've got a plugin that is inheriting from that plugin base. From here, all of this, the work that we saw on that last page, is still happening. It's just happening behind the scenes. And so we've got a very simple, straightforward plugin that's easy to read, easy to debug. Base classes are something that all of your developers, once they begin using them, are going to love. So they get a whole bunch of functionality that they didn't have to write themselves for free every time. So they can get configurable logging for every transaction that's against the database. No matter what it was, the call that they made, you can get a full start time and end time and exactly what was executed against your database. Again, without writing a single line of code for your plugin. You can get serialized configuration settings. So instead of a long text string that you have to go through and parse for yourself, you can just access an object that has those methods that has those settings as properties of an object. We also have easy access to the information from the context. Instead of having to go and create a logger yourself or try and find the image, it's just there as a property of the base class. The possibilities really are endless. So to get a start on these base classes, there's an excellent article by Jonas Rapp called I Get By with a Little Help from My Base Class, and he even has a sample base class that you can use. Let's talk next about separation of controllers. Separation of controllers, unlike the last two topics, isn't a language feature like base classes or extension methods. It's just a way that we can organize our code and prevent the copy-paste anti-pattern that emerges when our code is all mixed together in a single plugin class. So typically, if you have a plugin and a contact plugin and you need some code from one to the other, we end up getting people copying code out of the account plugin, pasting it into contact, and it becomes unwieldy quickly. Instead, we should separate out the controllers, so all the business logic, into an account controller and a contact controller. Then when our contact controller, as an example, has a new method that is relevant to the account plugin that we have here, a method called getContacts that takes an account, we simply have to make a reference from one controller to the other, and now this account plugin has gotten access to that method without any copying, pasting, or duplication of code. We can even have dissimilar code pieces that have access to this shared code. So in this case, we have a qualified lead custom action, and it has its own controller that's pointing, that has the business logic for leads. So when we have a need for something from our contact controller, we make a simple reference there, and now we have code that's shared across both plugins and actions. Let's talk a little bit about the open source development that happened a number of years ago. At first glance, it might seem that this is the opposite of laziness. We've got developers who are working long nights and evenings for free, basically, so that other people can take advantage of their code. I would suggest that we should look to who I consider the master of laziness when we're considering this topic. So my favorite guy is Ron Swanson, and he has a quote that says, "Normally, if given the choice between doing something and nothing, I'd choose to do nothing. But I'll do something if it helps someone else do nothing. I'd work all night if it meant I got nothing done. If it meant nothing got done." So all of the concepts that we talked about before, I know I have not delved into enough that you can feel comfortable going back to your code and start implementing. Luckily, there is a ton of open source code out there that you can either use directly as is inside your projects, or you can take as examples. So all of these base classes, I've taken something from at one time or another and implemented inside my own base classes. Use it as is or take it as an example. All right, let's move on a little bit from talking about development practices and technologies and talk about the processes that you have inside your organization. So something that all of us are doing, whether you're a developer or not, on a regular basis are combining solutions, deploying solutions, creating backups and restores, upgrading environments, refreshing data, and doing data integrity checks. All of this you're having done by a person who makes mistakes. They forget things. They forget to document. So why are we doing something that's done so repetitively by humans? So I know that almost everyone who's watching this is aware of PowerShell and knows that it's been out there for a long time. But I find a surprisingly few people are actually out and doing it. So an excellent introductory article that I'm going to suggest that you go out and take a look at is by Kelvin Shen. And if I go out to this link for a moment, you can see that he has a list here that's fairly comprehensive of all of the PowerShell libraries that have been developed at this point to be working with our D365 environment. I'd strongly recommend you come out, take a look at these, and start with something simple, just combining two solutions or making a publish go through. The things that you can do with PowerShell are going to make your processes reliable and faster. We're just tired of watching spinners run all day. The PowerShell tools can make that happen for you in the background. All right, let's talk about additional redundant processes. I know that I spend a significant portion of my day looking at spinners, but there's spinners that you can avoid and there's spinners that you can't. So one of the spinners that you can avoid is your code deployment. It takes a long time if you've got large solutions deploying code up to the cloud. The things that we're deploying on a regular basis are web resources and then our C# assemblies. There's ways that you can significantly cut down this process which is going to allow you to keep in your flow of development without having to be waiting for the deployment processes between each iteration that you're testing something. So when it comes to client-side development, I'd strongly recommend that you take a look into Fiddler's Autoresponder capabilities. I'm going to briefly break down how it works. So we start with a Dynamics 365 request, and we want to get a web page from it. When we request that request comes through, and Autoresponder stops that request and takes a look at the address, the name of the page that we're looking for. It knows that it has a rule, and so it pulls that resource off of the hard drive and responds with that instead. So instead of getting the code that has been deployed, we're getting the code that comes off the hard drive that Autoresponder has a rule set up for. The benefits of this are numerous. First one is that it's instantaneous. As soon as you save a file inside your Visual Studio environment, that file is immediately available for testing. There's no waiting, and there's no clicking through UIs to go publish it. It's non-invasive. You're able to see the results of the code, to test it against your local hard drive without it impacting any other developers. You could have totally breaking code, and they're not going to see it and don't care what it is that you've deployed because it doesn't impact them. And then finally, you're able to do this against multiple environments. The one rule that developers should never break is that we don't test our code against live environments. When it comes to a tool like Fiddler Autoresponder, though, you can have a live environment that you're able to test upcoming code with, and because it doesn't impact any other users in the system, you're able to test it against that live system. So our hat tip for Fiddler Autoresponder goes out to Peter Hecky. He has an article streamlining JavaScript web resource development using Fiddler Autoresponder. I know that a lot of people have attempted Autoresponder in the past and had some difficulties getting it working. This article I feel is one of the strongest ones out there to get you using Autoresponder with your D365 environment. The next kind of deployment that we're doing on a regular basis is our managed code, our plugin code. So for plugin code, guess who's back? It's PowerShell again. So it's possible using this article from, and I'm going to butcher this name, Machen Willagers, to be able to have a PowerShell script that you execute that completely eliminates needing to deploy it using the UI in XRM Toolkit or the plugin registration tool. You just double-click your PowerShell script and it's off to the races. If you want it to be deploying plugin code after every build, you can actually set that up in Visual Studio that it'll execute that PowerShell afterwards, and as soon as you build your code, it's on its way off to the cloud. Let's take a moment to talk a little bit about web API development and how we can be automating that. So too often junior developers I see going out and trying one web API URL call, and the process then is that they have to build their code, deploy it, and they're doing it all inside Visual Studio. All of your web API calls should really be tested in a tool like Postman before you ever start writing your first line of code. Postman is going to give you instant feedback about whether you got a successful callback or not, and there's tons of downloadable collections that are available. So you're not even having to write the code yourself the first time. Postman also has a little known feature off to the right that has the ability to emit JavaScript, C# or PowerShell code for you based off of the URL that you've created. So it's going to take it even one step further, and you don't have to write the code yourself. Federico Josit has a great article on how to be working with Postman inside D365 at this link, and then he also has a Postman collection that you can download, so you're going to have dozens of calls that you can just run right off the bat without having to write your first line of code. So I might have lied. I think this is probably the only true original thing in here. This is the workflow that I personally use for doing plugins. Maybe you're doing something similar already, but I think it's helpful to share how I approach these. So when I start on a new plugin development, the first thing I do is create a plugin shell. All it is a plugin that does absolutely nothing, and I then deploy that empty plugin to the D365 environment. After I've done that, I go out and enable Profiler and start profiling. Profiler has the ability to record everything that is sent to a plugin, and so you can, on a plugin by plugin basis, enable it, and it's going to start recording actions that happen in D365 that would trigger that plugin. I then go into the D365 environment and trigger the plugin using the user interface. At that point, I'm able to turn off my profiler and go begin coding. Then when the I'm ready to start debugging, I've got that previously recorded session with all the variables that come in. I'm able to attach my debugger in Visual Studio to the profiler and step through my code without impacting anything inside the live system. All of my code is instantly available for testing immediately after I write it and compile it, and I'm able to deploy fully tested code without it ever worrying about breaking changes or bugs inside that code. So our last hat tip of the presentation goes out to Jim Daly. There's an article out on Microsoft's site called Debugging a Plugin that will walk you through these steps. And it just reminds me of multiple times that I've been working with junior developers who are really struggling to understand what it is that's wrong with their plugin based exclusively off of error messages and logs. There's a better way to do it that allows you to see the context of all variables, see exactly which line something is failing on, and if you haven't been doing any plugin debugging using Profiler yet, you really need to take a moment to go out and learn this methodology and give it a spin. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for attending my presentation for DynamicsCon. Thank you, DynamicsCon, for choosing me for my first presentation. Remember that we are going to have a question and answer session coming up next, so make sure to stay on for that. Thank you. All right, thank you everybody for listening. My name again is Troy Dahnert. I'm with Stone Ridge Software. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I know it was a lot of dense technical material. That's why I wanted to make sure that I've got good links inside there. And I really do love the opportunity to network with other people who are interested in these topics. If you write me, I guarantee you that I'm going to get back in contact with you, and I'd be happy to look at any of these topics that you have. So I had a few questions in chat. If I wasn't clear on any of that, I'd be happy to have to cover that in some more detail, or if we've got some additional questions.
Troy, I did pull those questions if you wanted me to ask them again. And
sounds good.
Answers on there. So one question we got was, which languages or packages have you used base classes in?
So the base classes can be used inside any .NET language. It's really just basic inheritance that we're talking about here, but there are so many excellent libraries that other people have already done the work for you out there. The libraries that I've got links for inside the presentation are all done inside C#, but there's no reason if you were doing plugin development inside VB.NET or something like that, that you couldn't do the same thing in those.
Sure. And we did get a second question. Do we have to add any extra NuGet package references for use of extensions?
Nope, there's nothing required in NuGet. This is all .NET language included functionality. So really all you have to do is change existing. That's what's so powerful about this, is that everyone has methods that you're already using inside helper classes. All you have to do is add an additional variable at the front of them using the this keyword, and then go out to your make sure that the reference to the namespace is inside your other code, and you can immediately just start using the classes that the methods you've already written in a much more powerful way.
Perfect. And then we did get a couple more come in. One question was, have you or do you use Playwright?
I haven't. I'm Googling it as we speak, but I'd love to hear more about it. I'll do some research on that after the session here.
Sure. And then someone also would like to know any recommended way to deploy plugin code and JavaScript directly from DevOps?
So yeah, I mean, there are. So it kind of depends on if we're talking right now from Visual Studio as you're writing it, or otherwise it's a whole other topic starting to talk about change management and creating DevOps pipelines and things like that for doing deployment. So the several larger projects I've worked on recently, you're able to use DevOps to be able to automatically be taking code that you've checked into DevOps and make sure that's deploying, and then even using DevOps to be choosing which environments it is that you've deployed which code to, and keeping track of things like branching and so on. But the topics that I had on today was specifically during the development and not so much the deployment cycle. And it's ways that you can be writing your code and debugging it directly against your hard drive without ever having to push any of your code to the cloud, so that you know that the code that you're working with has been tested and is completely functional, so you're not bumping into even other developers before you push it up. It's completely tested and ready to go. And that we should say also that an alternative to this is setting up unit tests and tests that you automated testing against your code. That can be an alternative way to using something like Plugin Profiler. If you've got these tests ahead of time, you're again debugging directly on your hard drive and not trying to do the slow development cycle of pushing code up to the cloud and then going through the whole user interface to be testing that and everything. So that's the big thing that we want to avoid, is the time loss of pushing it up there and trying to do debugging by using the user interface.
Awesome. And then we got another one come in. Have you used GitHub Actions for automated deployments in Dynamics?
GitHub Actions for automated deployments. I have not. So Nancy is talking about, again, preferring unit testing. I would agree unit testing is kind of the gold standard because you want those unit tests for long term. I think that Plugin Profiler can be a fast intermediary way to get someone up to speed on at least doing their development on their local hard drive without, if they haven't taken the time to get into unit testing, learning things one at a time. But the gold standard is unit testing.
Yep. Have you looked into Fake XRM Easy for unit testing of plugins?
Yeah, Fake XRM Easy is my favorite platform currently for doing those unit tests. And I would agree with what everyone said here. That's the gold standard. That's the best way to go. But some people find that kind of a big bite to take off. And Plugin Profiler can be an excellent way, especially if you just got some short, fast things that you're doing to address that. Unit tests are better, though. So I appreciate everyone's time. I'm happy to stick around. Thank you so much for coming out for the session. I enjoyed putting together, like I said, this is a unique experience. I've got some fear of speaking in public, and it was a good chance to step outside my shell a little bit and try something that I don't do every day. So thanks for your time, everyone.